So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Bell Hook's essay Understanding Patriarchy. We have already had a series of lectures on this essay. I'll just summarize quickly what we've covered so far and then move on with this text. So we're seeing how one of the qualities of this particular essay is its experientiality and directness. So it often relies on anecdotal evidence, experiential evidence, and obviously there's very rich discursive framework as well, which this essay sort of draws on. And one of the very interesting and complex things which this essay does is that it moves away from this very binaristic understanding of bad men and victim women, and talks about how patriarchy as a system, patriarchy as an epistemic, discursive, experiential system can affect men as well as women. More often it can affect men in worse ways than it can affect women. Again, Hooks moves away from this understanding of patriarchy as some kind of an ownership that men have over women, or some kind of a privileged system that only privileges men over women. So it's a very interesting model that she offers, and she obviously is decrying and is quite critical of that brand of feminism which look at men as enemies of feminism. So again, this is a more complex and more holistic understanding of patriarchy, one which needs attention, especially in a course like this. Okay, so she talks about how the word patriarchy was used by feminists, quite rightly so, to replace words such as male chauvinism and sexism, because patriarchy, the way Hooks defines and describes it, it has the root of all the problems affecting gender behavior, affecting gender discrimination, etc. So patriarchy becomes a system, a consolidated system, which is consolidated by men as well as women. And then we also saw instances of how Hooks says that it's not necessarily true that families run by women only, where the father figure is conspicuously absent, it's not necessarily true that those families end up being less patriarchal than other families. More often they end up being more patriarchal. So again, the question is not really about biological determinism. It's not really about whether someone is biologically male or biologically female. It's about a question of appropriation. To what extent are you appropriating the system of patriarchy? To what extent are you enacting the system of patriarchy? To what extent are you systematizing it in terms of a consolidated behavior? Okay, so this is a section on your screen, and where Hooks says, it is no accident that feminists began to use the word patriarchy. So I'm just rehearsing a little bit what we've already done, and then we'll move on with this the main lecture, where she says that it is no accident that feminists began to use the word patriarchy to replace the more commonly used male chauvinism and sexism. So the words male chauvinism and sexism were replaced by patriarchy because patriarchy was a more loaded word with more loaded connotations. These courageous voices wanted men and women to become more aware of the way patriarchy affects us all. So again, the question of effect becomes very important, and the question of how men and women get affected equally by patriarchy becomes very, very important. And obviously, Hooks is quite critical, and she cites one of her essays that she had sort of written in 1984, an essay called Men, Comrades and Struggle. So again, the whole question is to be as inclusive as possible, take in men as comrades in struggle against patriarchy, where she had said quite clearly that separatist ideology encourages women to ignore the negative impact of sexism on male personhood. So, it's not a question of transferring blame. It's not a question of ownership of victimhood. It's not a question of, localizing victimhood on women and localizing oppression on men. If you retain that frame, if you retain that structure, then obviously patriarchy cannot be dismantled. Patriarchy can only be dismantled when men and women take a more collaborative approach. And this collaborative culture, this collaborative critical idiom, is something that Hooks is advocating in her brand of feminism. Okay, so that's something that we have seen already, and that's something that we keep coming back to throughout this essay. Okay, so this should be on your screen, where Hooks is sort of talking about how patriarchy demands of men. So this is a section on your screen which should be, which we'll read in some details now, where Hooks says, patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples. Since it is a system that denies men full access to the freedom of will, it's difficult for any man of any class to rebel against patriarchy, to be disloyal to the patriarchal parent, to be that parent female or male. So And in a way, as I already mentioned, I may have already mentioned, that we can find some resonances of this being enacted at an experiential level in George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, where the whole idea of going against the patriarchal system, which is obviously part of the imperial system, becomes a very, very difficult task. And Orwell ends up being a slave to patriarchy. He ends up being a slave to the imperial logic, to the imperial will, and they can't rebel against it. So, patriarchy demands of men that they efface their emotions, they do away with the emotions, and so in a way that cripples them emotionally. Okay, so and this is an example that Hooks offers OAM, and she offers again one of the key things about this essay, as in Fanos' black skin, white marks, as I already have mentioned, that it keeps drawing on anecdotal evidence, it keeps drawing on personal examples, and therein lies the directness, the immediacy of this particular essay at an experiential, immediate level. So this is a section that Hooks talks about, a real case study, if you will, of a person that she saw firsthand, and the person that she was intimate with, how patriarchy operated on that person, and what were the changes that she observed in that person over a course of time. So this is what she says over here. The man who has been my primary bond for more than 12 years was traumatized by the patriarchal dynamics in his family of origin. So this should be on the screen. When I met him, he was in his 20s. While his formative years had been spent in the company of a violent, alcoholic dad, his circumstances changed when he was 12 and he began to live alone with his mother. In the early years of a relationship, he talked openly about his hostility and rage towards his abusing dad. He was not interested in forgiving him or understanding the circumstances that had shaped and influenced his dad's life, either in his childhood or in his working life as a military man. So it's a very interesting example. So we're talking about a person who grew up in a sort of an abusive family where the father was abusive and alcoholic and violent, and then he ended up hating the father. He ended up not forgiving the father, but then he wasn't interested in questioning and looking at the background of his father, the childhood of his father, the fact that his father happened to be a military man. The father happened to may have had a difficult childhood. I mean, these are questions that went unquestioned, and no one bothered about these questions at all. And that's an important thing for Hooks. In the early years of a relationship, he was extremely critical of male domination of women and children. Although he did not use the word patriarchy, he understood its meaning, and he opposed him. His gentle, quiet manner often led folks to ignore him, counting him among the weak and the powerless. So again, the question of peer pressure, the question of collective gaze comes into being quite interestingly. So when he's not living up to the patriarchal principles, he ends up being mocked at, he ends up being jeered at, he ends up being ridiculed and not sort of considered adequate enough to be patriarchal. So by the age of 30, he began to assume a more macho persona, embracing the dominator model that he had once critiqued. So again, what Hooks is offering over here is the shifts in one person, the changes in one person, the experiential changes in one person. So here is a person, a male, who grew up in a very abusive setting with an alcoholic father, a violent father, and that kind of a traumatic childhood left scars in his mind, and he ended up hating male violence, he ended up hating male domination, and he was this very sensitive, meek, gentle person, but then he was ridiculed by his male peers. He was sort of mocked at by his male peers, and he was considered inadequate by his male peers. And so after a point of time, when he reached the age of 30, he began to appropriate a more macho persona, a more manly, quote-unquote, manly persona. And that was a very visible and conspicuous change that Hooks seems to sort of notice and describe over here. So he donned the same dominator model that he had once critiqued as a child, as an early, as a young man. Donning the mantle of patriarch, he gained greater respect and visibility. More women were drawn to him. He was noticed more in public space. His criticism of male domination ceased, and indeed he began to mouth patriarchal rhetoric, saying the kind of sexist stuff that that appalled him in the past. So with his appropriation, I mean, look at the different orders of appropriation over here. There is a sartorial order. There is a linguistic order. He begins to speak in a particular language, which is sexist, sometimes abusive, sometimes violent. The violence and sexism obviously directed against women. But interestingly and almost perversely, this is what makes him popular among women. more women are drawn to him, and he becomes more visible in the public space. So again, the question of public space becomes very important. The public space becomes very important, and as we know, we have already spent some time talking about private and public space, especially when we looked at Hannah Arendt, Lyotard, etc. So the question of public appearance, the question of public presence becomes very important. And if you're in a public presence, then more often than not, you basically appropriate, it helps you if you appropriate the dominant discursive model. And the dominant discursive model over here is that for a man to be a very, very alpha male and violent and abusive and patriarchal. And that dominant discursive model becomes a convenient appropriation for him, because then he becomes popular, he rises in a popularity ladder, and more people take him more seriously, etc. And he ends up saying, he ends up mounting the same patriarchal logic, the same patriarchal rhetoric. He ends up saying things which have appalled him in the past. Okay, so these changes in his thinking and behavior were triggered by his desire to be accepted and affirmed in a patriarchal workplace, and rationalized by his desire to get ahead. His story is not unusual. Boys brutalized and victimized by patriarchy more often than not become patriarchal, embodying the abusive patriarchal masculinity that they once clearly recognized as evil. Few men brutally abuse boys in the name of patriarchal maleness, courageously resist the brainwashing, and remain true to themselves. Most males conform to patriarchy in one way or another. So the question of conforming becomes very important, and Hook says very interestingly that how boys who grow up in patriarchal household, boys who grow up often brutalized and traumatized by patriarchal principles, they grow to this different process of transition. So they may start off by hating patriarchy, they may start off being appalled by patriarchy, and then increasingly they become more and more patriarchal themselves, and they end up being the same patriarchal father figure that they once hated once upon a time. So most males conform to patriarchy in one way or the other. So again, this is where one can use Butler very, very interestingly, because it's not something which is innately biological. The entire patriarchal principle is something that you need to appropriate. It's something you need to conform to. And again, there's a coded quality about patriarchy. The code is in language, the code is in dress, the code is in public social behavior, etc. So this coded quality becomes very important, and the question of appropriation becomes all the more important when it comes to this particular coded quality. So you're appropriating codes, you're conforming to certain codes, and this question of conformity and non-conformity becomes the key question, the moot question when it comes to patriarchy and patriarchal performance. Okay, and then Hooks goes on to say, indeed, radical feminist critique of patriarchy has practically been silenced in our culture. It has become a subcultural discourse available only to well-educated elites. Even in those circles, using the word patriarchy is regarded as passé. Often in my lectures, when I use the phrase imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy to describe our nation's political system, audiences laugh. No one has ever explained why accurately naming the system is funny. It functions as a disclaimer, discounting the significance of what is being named. It suggests that the words themselves are problematic and not the system they describe. I interpret this laughter as the audience's way of showing discomfort with being asked to ally themselves with an anti-patriarchal, disobedient critique. This laughter reminds me that if I dare to challenge patriarchy openly, I risk not being taken seriously. So even at the purely linguistic level, when you mention a certain term and you're laughed at, and this is slightly psychoanalytical as well, that Hooks is saying that when I get a laughter response from audiences when I use a term such as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, people are saying I'm using rhetoric, people are saying that I'm using a lot of loaded terms without meaning anything, and they laugh, they mock at that kind of an expression. But this mockery, this laughter may be interpreted as a discomfort. And what's this discomfort for? This discomfort is, for the expectation to ally themselves against patriarchy, right? That's a very uncomfortable position to take, to ally yourself against patriarchy. And therein lies a discomfort, therein lies a problem that Hooks situates quite clearly over here. So even at the linguistic level, even at the level of linguistic expressions, language expressions, articulations, one might find complete conformity and non-conformity to patriarchy and different patriarchal principles in operation. Okay, so citizens in this nation fear challenging patriarchy even as they lack overt awareness that they're fearful, so deeply embedded in our collective unconscious are the rules of patriarchy. So like all grand narratives, there's has to be a degree of embeddedness about patriarchy. So, and like I said at the very beginning of this particular text, it's hard to find a grand narrative which is also not patriarchal by default. And then if you talk about any grand narrative, nation, religion, anything, there's always grand patriarchal embeddedness that sort of marks, that qualifies the grand narrative in the first place. So, the roots are so deep, it is so deeply embedded at a subliminal, subconscious level that we're not even aware of our patriarchal construct or the constructed quality of patriarchy. It's just something so embedded in our system that it's almost biological in quality. It's almost like a metabolic activity. It's almost like a metabolic expectation, a metabolic response loop. Okay. So I often tell audiences that if we were to go door to door asking if we should end male violence against women, most people would give their unequivocal support. So, if there's a question out, for instance, and we go on interviewing people, asking them if violence against women should be stopped, then almost unequivocally people would say yes. It's an evil thing, it's a disgusting, it's a disturbing thing, it's a violent thing, an abusive thing, and it must be stopped at all costs. Then if you told them we can only stop male violence against women by ending male domination, by eradicating patriarchy, they would begin to hesitate to change their position. So if you rephrase it, if we actually rephrase it with the root problem, with the root condition of male violence, which is patriarchy, if you ask that question, that doesn't mean as a natural extension that we should end patriarchy, we should address the root problem, we should address male violence only by addressing patriarchy, then the answers, the responses will be more ambivalent and more equivocal. So therein lies the problem, and people refuse to. Or this is a collective denial that Hooks talked about earlier, which we saw already in one of the early lectures. The collective denial against the existence of patriarchy, that people don't realize it's actually patriarchy which is causing violence against women. So the very quick fire, the very quick heal solution to violence against women is punishment at an individual level, all kinds of punishment, capital punishment, imprisonment, etc. But if you really want to eradicate violence against women, the root problem is patriarchy. We need to address that problem. But therein lies a denial, therein lies a refusal, therein lies a rejection. So people are more hesitant to address the question of patriarchy. They're much more easy, they're much more effortless when it comes to punishing the male victim, the individual male victim, either by hanging the person or by executing the person. But if the question is whether we should stop patriarchy, whether we should address patriarchy as a problem, therein lies the hesitation of people. I mean, they're more reluctant, they're more hesitant to address the question of patriarchy more complexly. So despite the many gains of contemporary feminist movement, greater equality for women in the workforce, more tolerance for the relinquishing of rigid gender roles, patriarchy as a system remains intact. And many people continue to believe that it is needed if humans are to survive as a species. So not only has patriarchy been intact, not only has patriarchy been consolidated, it seems to have a utility function in the collective imaginary of people, where they say that it's needed for the human species to survive. So capitalist patriarchal principles are requirements. So in a way, the same kind of a pseudo-logic which informed the civilized mission of imperialism, that imperialism is needed to civilize. So, like I said, this pseudo-logic is something which informed imperialism as well, where people say it was civilized mission, it was designed to elevate, emancipate the lower species, the colonized people, who obviously required civilization, who obviously required being relinquished from their inferior status, etc. So that kind of a pseudo-logic operates in patriarchy as well, where people say, this is required for the human species to survive on this particular planet. So there's always this logic which can be created to consolidate, to corroborate any grand narrative, and patriarchy being a classic case in point. Okay, so this belief seems ironic, given that the patriarchal methods of organizing nations, especially the insistence on violence as a means of social control, has actually led to the slaughter of millions of people on the planet. So this whole entire argument is perverse, paradoxically perverse, where people argue that patriarchy, or this entire capitalist, expansionist, imperialist patriarchal principles are required for the preservation of this planet. That's actually nonsense, because we've seen how millions of people have been slaughtered in the name of patriarchy, driven by the violence, driven by patriarchal desire for expansion, for consolidation, for control, patriarchal greed. And not just that, I mean, you can talk about something like global warming, or the entire idea of using of natural resources as a classic case in point of capitalist patriarchal greed, where you just end up using everything, overusing everything, overindulging in everything, and as a result to leave this planet endangered. And it doesn't require a war. Actually, we all know this particular planet is dying a natural death because there are resources being used up at a massive exponential rate, much more than what has been produced. So that is the classic case in point of patriarchal principles in operation. So even the natural hazards which have been caused at the moment are actually man-made, if you think about it deeply. So this entire idea of patriarchy being a bit of a rescuing mission, a bit of a preservation system, is perversely illogical and actually untrue. Almost entirely, because we've seen historical evidences, historical instances of patriarchal principles driving violence, which have caused millions of men and women to be killed in the name of war, in the name of patriarchal sort of ethos of nationalism, religion, etc. And there's so many wars still going on in the planet today in the name of religion, in the name of capitalism, in the name of ownership on land, ownership on companies, ownership on natural resources, and all of that is part of this patriarchal expansionist imperialist program, which is still in operation, very much so, either overtly or covertly in this planet. Okay, so until we can collectively acknowledge the damage patriarchy causes and the suffering it creates, one cannot address male pain. So again, the question of male pain becomes very important for bell hooks, because again, see, I mean, this is one of the really complex things which this essay does. It talks about patriarchy as an evil thing. It talks about patriarchy as a dangerous enterprise, something which is deeply and dogmatically dangerous. However, it also looks at patriarchy as not really being controlled by men alone. It looks at patriarchy as something which affects men, in a very painful way, in the same way as it affects women. Women are often victims of patriarchy, but so are men who suffer patriarchy in more psychological ways. So we cannot demand for men to be right on men the right to be whole, to be givers and sustainers of life. Obviously, some patriarchal men are reliable and even benevolent caretakers and providers, but still they are imprisoned by a system that undermines their mental health. So at the very beginning of this essay, we saw how Hooks talked about patriarchy as a pathological problem. It's almost a medical problem. It's something which affects people psychologically, affects people mentally. And she says quite clearly over here that there may be instances of patriarchal men who are benevolent, who are giving, generous, etc. But at the same time, despite that, they are still imprisoned in that patriarchal prison, really, the patriarchal system, which imprisons them in terms of undermining their thought process, undermining their agency, undermining their natural will, natural propensity, etc. So it becomes a mental problem, becomes a psychological problem, and this psychologization of patriarchy is something that is part of the internalization. That is so deeply internalized that these benevolent men, even in the acts of benevolence, they end up being patriarchal. Even in the acts of giving and being generous and taking care of people, they do it from a patriarchal perspective. And that's what makes them patriarchal. That's actually sad, according to Hooks, because it just reveals a slight aberration in mental health. It just reveals the degree of internalization that these men have suffered in the hands of patriarchy. Okay, so we stop at this point in this lecture, but just to reiterate, just summarize quickly, Hooks is looking at patriarchy as a system which is obviously affecting people. It affects people psychologically, culturally, discursively, experientially, and patriarchy operates in micro, intimate, as well as macro cultural levels. And its constant intersection between these two levels, macro and micro, is what makes patriarchy such a dangerous dogmatic system. And obviously, it doesn't appear to be a dogmatic system because that's part of the grand narrative success. The success of being a grand narrative, it doesn't appear dogmatic in the first place. It appears as a natural given, almost a biological truth, a truism informed and overdetermined by biology. And that's something which is part of the success plan of patriarchy, the success story of patriarchy. And Hooks obviously looks at patriarchy as a mental problem, as a psychological problem. She pathologizes it and considers that to be an aberration of true health, true mental health, and which this particular aberration affects men and women equally. And there are different kinds of suffering, but both men and women suffer under the hands of patriarchy, and that's what makes this particular essay such a complex essay in terms of understanding patriarchy. So we'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this text in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.